Hello, today I'm going to be talking about how childhood trauma affects cognitive processing and depression treatment. And I'm going to be focusing on two studies that show how our early experiences can shape the way we think and respond to different therapeutic approaches. Before going into both studies, I just want to talk about why this topic matters. I think childhood trauma doesn't just create emotional scars, but it changes how our brains process information. And individuals who have childhood trauma, they often develop different ways of processing information, and they show altered cognitive flexibility and have unique patterns of emotional regulation. These cognitive changes can really impact how people engage with and respond to therapy. So the first study that I'm going to be discussing is the treatment for adolescents with depression study. The researchers asked a really important question, which is, how does childhood trauma affect an adolescent's ability to engage with cognitive therapy? The researchers were really interested in how trauma impacts three cognitive processes. One is the ability to identify and challenge negative thoughts. The second is the capacity to learn new thinking patterns. And the third is how therapeutic information is processed. So the researchers wanted to know if trauma creates a different operating system that makes it harder to benefit from cognitive interventions. Going into our methods, the researchers designed a study with 427 depressed adolescents, and they created 4 treatment groups. One would receive cognitive behavioral therapy, and this focuses on changing thought patterns. Another group would be receiving fluoxetine, which is a medication. Third group would be receiving both treatments, and a fourth group receiving a placebo. This design was really clever because it allowed them to separate the effects of cognitive interventions from biological ones. And they tracked the severity of depression and were able to carefully assess each participant's trauma history, which essentially created a map of how different interventions worked for different cognitive processing styles. And jumping into our results, if we're looking at the graph here, which is figure 1 from the study, you see that the lines represent different treatment conditions over 12 weeks. If we're focusing on the blue line, that's showing CBT response, cognitive behavioral therapy. So we see that for adolescents without trauma history, CBT worked fairly well. You can see the line trending downwards, which indicates improvement. But if we're looking at the trauma group, we can see that something interesting happens. The CBT line stays pretty flat, which is suggesting that trauma-affected teens weren't able to engage with cognitive therapy in a similar way. And the combined treatment maintained its effectiveness regardless of trauma history, which suggests that some teens might need multiple approaches to overcome trauma-related cognitive barriers. Okay, going into our second study, which is childhood trauma and differential response to long-term psychoanalytic versus cognitive behavioral therapy for chronic depression in adults. And for this study, researchers compared how adults with chronic depression responded to two distinct types of cognitive intervention. The researchers wanted to understand why some people might respond better to structured cognitive therapy, while others benefit more from exploratory approaches. This study was really interesting because it looked at both explicit and cognitive processing, which is the kind we're consciously aware of, and implicit processing, which happens beneath our awareness. In this study, the researchers were wanting to know how childhood trauma might affect these different types of cognitive processing in ways that might influence treatment success. For this study, the researchers followed 210 adults with chronic depression over a 5-year period, and they compared two treatment approaches, which was cognitive behavioral therapy and psychoanalytic therapy. For the CBT, it provides structured exercises for changing thought patterns, and for psychoanalytic therapy, it explores how past experiences influence current thinking. And so the researchers wanted to see what approach would work better for people with different trauma backgrounds. And moving on to our results, we have the graph here. It's figure 1 in the study. And what we can see here is the treatment response over 5 years. The solid lighter blue line represents CBT, and the solid darker blue line represents psychoanalytic therapy. And the most surprising finding is shown when we look at patients with high trauma scores. We can see how the line for psychoanalytic therapy is showing a steeper decline, which means greater improvement. But when we're comparing it to CBT, we can see that the brain, the trauma-affected brain responds better to a more flexible approach. And the individuals with lower trauma scores, you can see both treatments worked pretty well, which is suggesting that trauma doesn't just affect what we're thinking, but how we process and integrate new information. Okay, and when we are putting these two studies together, they're clearly showing us that childhood trauma fundamentally affects how people process therapeutic information. In adolescence, we are able to see that trauma can interfere with traditional cognitive interventions, meanwhile in adults, we were able to see that some people might need a more flexible approach to overcome trauma-related cognitive patterns. And so I think that these findings really help us explain why one-size-fits-all approaches can often fall short. And so I think moving forward, considering processing capacity and treatment planning, and adapting therapeutic approach to cognitive style, and investigating specific cognitive mechanisms would really help us better understand how trauma affects different cognitive systems and how we can better tailor treatments to work with rather than against. And thank you everyone for your attention. I really think that these studies help us better understand why treating depression isn't just about what we treat, but how we treat it.